evening to everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us on the third and final webinar series in collaboration with the Aga Khan Education Board for Canada. My name is Yasser Hamid, and I'm a volunteer with the Aga Khan Education Board for Pakistan. Recently, Aga Khan Education Board started a career webinar series on study abroad with Aga Khan Board for Canada, where we have colleagues on the board who will be sharing their experiences with all of us. In the first webinar, we learned about the undergraduate studies and the funding opportunities with Khatija Jeta and Anis Umidali, followed by the second webinar that covered the graduate studies in Canada and the funding pathways by the eminent speakers Khatija Jeta and Zinat Ali Sutar. And today we're having this third webinar with Zia on maintaining your status as an international student. For the audience who have missed the first two webinar sessions, I will post the link in the chat later. So today's webinar is going to be divided into three parts. The first part consists of the process of applying for a study permit. The second part focuses on what the international students need to show when applying, and finally, how to maintain the status as an international student. This session is being streamed. So the session format now is that this session, since it's being streamed on YouTube, those who are attending the live session are requested to leave the questions in the comment box, and we will pick your questions from there and ask the speaker at the end of the session. For the question and answer session, I would like to request everyone that the questions asked are related to the topic, and they refrain from asking questions related to PR and immigration. Now, I would like to introduce the guest speaker, Zia Sumar, a Canadian immigration lawyer, barrister, and solicitor. She practice encompasses all areas of economic immigration through temporary and permanent residence applications in addition to citizenship. She assists a broad array of clientele in the economic streams. Zia specializes in providing immigration planning strategies to large multinational organizations and corporations, as well as the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. She conducts informational presentations on immigration programs and has been invited to present across Canada and in the United States. Zia is an active member of Canada's legal and immigration communities. She has argued in federal court, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, and stands as the citizenship and immigration lead and subject matter expert for the settlement portfolio of the Ismaili Council for Ontario and the National Settlement Portfolio of the Ismaili Council for Canada. She is also an executive committee member of the Citizenship and Immigration section of the Ontario Bar Association. Over to you, Zia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. So I want to jump right in. Today, like Yasser said, we're going to be talking about the path of applying and coming to Canada as an international student. And then, of course, once you're here in Canada, how to keep your status, work while you're here, and apply afterwards for your postgrad work permit. So let's get started. Now, before we jump in, I want to give an overview. So when we're talking about immigration in Canada, there's three types of statuses. You have temporary residence, permanent residence, and citizenship. Like Yasser said, today we're going to be focusing on temporary residence, and more specifically, we're going to be looking at a study permit, so coming to Canada to study. So let's talk first about how to get that study permit. Okay. Now, what is a study permit? A study permit is a document that's issued by Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, which is the immigration body here that deals with immigration. And it allows a foreign national to come to Canada and study at a designated learning institution. So what Immigration has done, what Immigration Canada has done is said, okay, there are specific schools that we will issue study permits for. And these are called designated learning institutions. So it's a school that's approved by the government to host international students. On IRCC's website, you will find a list of designated learning institutions. When you're looking at programs, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but when you're looking at programs, when you're looking at schools in Canada, you want to make sure that the school that you're applying to is considered a designated learning institution. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that there's a difference between a temporary resident visa and the permit itself. So the way I like to think about it is that the visa is like an entry document. So individuals from certain countries require a visa in order to be able to enter Canada. It's like a key. It allows you to enter the door, okay? Whereas the permit is the status document that you hold while you're here in Canada. Okay, so two things to keep in mind, your temporary resident visa and your permit. Now, when you're applying for your initial study permit from outside of Canada, the application that you submit will be for both the visa and the study permit. Okay, so it happens all together at once. When your application that you've submitted online is approved, the first thing you'll get is a request for your passport. And this is where IRCC takes your passport and issues you the temporary resident visa into your passport. It's like a sticker that goes in your passport. That's what allows you to actually board your flight and come to Canada. Okay. And when your study permit is approved, you get an approval letter, and that's what you show at the border here in Canada in order to enter and get the physical study permit itself. So what do you need to keep in mind when you're applying for your study permit? Well, like I said, before you can start the application process, the first step is that you need to be accepted at a designated learning institution. Okay. It's only after you've been accepted into a program of study here in Canada that we then actually can submit the study permit application. Okay, so one of the biggest precursors is needing to apply to the school, get that acceptance letter, and then we can submit the study permit application. Another important part is your funds. Okay, so what Immigration Canada is looking for is to see that you will be able to financially support yourself while you're here in Canada. And if you're bringing family with you, that you'll be able to support your family as well. They want to ensure that you have the funds to support yourselves and won't need to work during that period. So even though study permits allow you to work, when an officer is reviewing your application, they're looking to see, okay, can you support yourself without working in Canada? Now, the exact amount that you have to be able to show will depend on a couple factors. So first, you want to keep in mind the program you're studying in and the tuition that's associated with that program. The second thing you want to keep in mind is the size of your family. So obviously it's going to be different for someone who's coming as a single individual versus someone who has a spouse and children. Okay, the rule of thumb is that in addition to your tuition, you will need 10,000 Canadian for your living expenses for year one. And for a spouse, it's an additional 4,000. And then for every additional child, it's 3,000 per child. Okay, now that's only for the first year. Okay, so if you're doing a multiple year program, so let's say you're coming to Canada to do an undergraduate degree, a 4-year bachelor's program. Well, when you submit your initial study permit application, the requirement is that you can show that you can financially support yourself and any accompanying family members for year one. Okay, so you don't have to show that you can provide the tuition and living expenses and everything all up front in savings during that initial application. However, the officer is looking to ensure that you will have some reasonable way to pay years 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so you have to have the savings right away for year 1, and it has to be reasonable. There has to be some way for you to be able to pay years 2, 3, and 4. Okay. The other aspects that they're looking at is that you have an intention to study. So when an officer is evaluating your application, they want to see that you have an intent to come here and actually study in the program that you've selected and that you've been accepted into, and that while you're here, your intent is also to follow the law, the immigration regulations of Canada, right? And part of that is they're looking to say, okay, will this person comply with immigration rules? And if they don't have any further status, will they leave at the end of their period of authorized stay? Now, this is a very important part of the study permit application. Okay, a lot of officers will focus their review on these. The other two are very clear cut. Do you have your acceptance? Do you have your funds? These are where the officer's discretion come in. Okay, so they're making a judgment based on the application, based on your background and what you submit in your application. For the intention to study, what they're looking to understand is why you've selected the program that you're using as part of your application. Okay, they're looking to say, okay, what are you going to do with this program after you finish it? How does it help your career? So they're really looking at your whole plan overall. Okay, why did you select this program? What's your background? Is it related to this program? What have you explained is your intention to use this program after you've completed it? How does it help your career? All of these go into an officer's determination of your intention to study here in Canada. The second part is that, again, like I said, that they want to see that you follow immigration rules. When an officer is reviewing their case, basically they're looking to say, are you going to comply? Are you going to leave at the end of your period of authorized stay? And so here they're evaluating your ties to Canada. They're evaluating your ties to your country of citizenship. They're looking at your travel history, right? They're looking to see, will you comply? Will you leave if you can't extend your status? And so when you're preparing an application, and we'll talk a little bit about documents in a moment, but you want to keep these factors in mind because this is what the officer is using to evaluate whether or not they approve your study permit application. So let's look at the application process. So like we said before, the first step is to apply to the school here in Canada. Once you have your acceptance letter, that's when we start actually submitting that study permit application. So that's when the immigration process itself begins. Now, if you think about the previous slide where we talked about intent and we talked about complying with immigration rules, when you're looking at schools, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but when you're looking at schools and when you're looking at particular programs, you want to keep your immigration application in mind as well, because you have to be able to explain why you've selected that particular school and that particular program, right? And why you're actually looking to come to study in Canada. All of this goes into your study plan and into your application. And, you know, I'll give the example that when an officer is looking at the application and when they're looking at your particular program, they are looking at your background as well, right? So if your entire background has been in banking, you're a financial officer at a bank, right? You've been working there for 20 years. And now you've applied to a program here in Canada in the culinary arts. So, you know, to become a chef here. They're going to look at it and say, okay, please help us understand, you know, your background is all in banking. Why are you now interested in coming to study in culinary arts? Okay. And so these are things you want to keep in mind when you're picking your school and picking your program. Now, once you have your acceptance letter, like I said, that's when we're preparing the actual study permit application. Very important to ensure that your application is complete and that it goes with what IRCC is looking for. Okay, so IRCC has a document checklist online. It lists all the forms and documents that are required at minimum to complete your application. Okay, so when you go onto Immigration Canada's website, you'll see that there's a checklist. It's a general checklist. And then on top of it, there's also a country-specific checklist. So depending on where you are applying from, you need to keep in mind both of these checklists in order to ensure that you have a complete application. Okay, but like I said, it's very important to understand also that these are the minimum documents that you need. Okay, so these without it, let's say that this country-specific checklist says that you need to have a police certificate and you apply without your police certificate. Well, that means your application is incomplete and will be rejected. Okay, but also remember that this does not mean that as long as you have every document listed on these checklists, that your application will be approved. Okay, these are the minimum documents that an officer requires, but it doesn't mean that they'll have everything that they need in order to approve your application. Okay, when you're preparing your study permit application, you want to think about what it is that you're trying to prove. So going back to our example, if someone did genuinely want to move into the culinary arts, maybe they've been working, their full-time job is working as a banking officer, but on the side, they've also had their own independent business where they cook on the weekends and have been, or bake on the weekends and have been selling that for a number of years and now want to take that a step further. That's fine, but you have to be able to explain that. And then generally, when you're preparing your application, you want to ensure that that's all documented and put in front of the officer. So again, important to ensure that the application package has the minimum documents and forms required, but that doesn't mean that that's everything that you need to put in your application. Now, once you have everything ready, that application gets submitted online. Okay. Submitted online and then you have to wait, unfortunately, right? That's the fun part of waiting for IRCC to get back to you. Depending on when you are starting your program, you want to think towards processing times, okay, because they do fluctuate. Typically, September intake, September start date is usually the busiest, right? And you can imagine that Immigration Canada gets a flood of applications during the summer and early or late spring in order for people to start their programs of study in September. So this past year in 2021, for the September start date, IRCC actually announced in May that any application that was received before May 15th would be guaranteed that they would have a decision by August 6th, so that the student would have time in order to prepare their travels and be actually able to travel to Canada. But any application that was submitted after May 15th, they did not guarantee that the student would have a decision in time for that September start date, or would have a decision in time in order for them to travel to start in the beginning of September. So you want to keep processing times in mind when you're preparing your application, when you're submitting it, because especially in that September, like I said, in the summertime, IRCC is busiest with study permit applications. And so you want to try and avoid being in a position where your application remains in processing, you haven't received a decision, and you're supposed to be starting your program. Now, once your application's in process, where they're required, IRCC will come back and ask you for your biometrics. They may come back and ask for your police certificates, depending, or medicals, just depending on your application. And then they'll give you a timeline. Really important to keep in mind the due dates for these documents. Sometimes they give you 30 days for biometrics. It's generally 30 days, but other documents can be shorter. We've seen requests for further documents where you only have 7 days to provide it to IRCC. So really important that when you've submitted your application, that you are checking to ensure if there are any updates, if there are any messages or requests, that you're responding to them. After everything is done, your application's been submitted, they're ready to approve it. What the first letter you get is your request for your visa, for your passport, right? So if you are required to have a visa, then the first request you get is a passport request letter, which gives you instructions for submitting your passport to IRCC so that they can issue that temporary resident visa for you to travel. And then you get your passport back, and it's all about making plans to travel here to Canada. Okay. When you are traveling, please make sure that you carry your letter of introduction, which is a letter that IRCC will issue you once your passport has been stamped with your TRV, and that you have, I always recommend having your proof of enrollment as well. Okay, so proof that you are still registered in a school here in Canada. Going back to the application itself, I want to cover some documents that generally you need to keep in mind when you're preparing your application. Okay. And when we're going through this, when we're talking about your documents, when you're preparing your application, always keep in mind what we've discussed in terms of what the officer is looking for, especially with regards to intent and compliance with Canadian immigration rules. So important documents, of course, first is going to be the acceptance letter, right? Like we've talked about, there is no application without your acceptance letter. The second thing is your proof of your funds, right? So your savings for your studies here in Canada. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be savings that you have in a bank account. You know, if you have family members that are supporting you, if you have scholarships that you've received, whatever it may be that you're using to fund your studies and your living expenses here in Canada, you want to make that very clear in your application so the officer does not have a question about how you're going to support yourself while you're here. With our clients, we always recommend that you have a study plan, okay, or a statement of intent. Now, this goes to explaining to the officer why you want to come to Canada and study, right? Why is it that Canada is your destination of choice? What is it about this program that you've selected that will help you, your career, your future? You know, especially because the investment is so high to come here to Canada to study. You know, tuition fees are higher. You're looking at living expenses. An officer wants to understand why you're looking to make that investment, and the study plan is the perfect place to do that. Right? It really is your explanation letter to the officer as to why you've selected this program, what you're going to do with it, and why that investment makes sense to your career. If they are required, and again, this does depend on where you're applying from and the type of application that you're submitting, language test results, right? So again, make sure you're checking with the checklists, the country-specific checklist from IRCC to see if you do need to provide your language, and similarly, if you need to provide your police certificates, okay? And then lastly, medicals for temporary residence. So whether or not someone requires medicals when you're applying for temporary residence depends on where you've resided over the last year. So if you've spent at least 6 months in a row in one of the listed countries within the past year, then you do require medicals. And Pakistan is a listed country. So if you have spent 6 months in a row in the last year, then you will be required to provide medicals for your study permit application. Now, with medicals, they don't necessarily need to be provided upfront. So you can still apply, you can still submit your study permit application without having done upfront medicals. What happens then is that IRCC officer will send you a request for your medicals after you've applied. Now, with that being said, sometimes the result of that, though, is longer processing times, right? Because you submit your application, officer starts reviewing it, they send you a request for medicals, you then have to go do your medicals, and then they'll come back and actually review and finalize that application. Where you can, I do generally recommend to people to do their medicals up front and include it with that initial application. Keep in mind, though, it is also now a timing issue because that medical results that you've submitted need to also be valid when you travel to Canada. Pre-COVID, it wasn't too much of an issue because, you know, within a few months, you'd submit your application, you'd be approved, and people would travel right away for studies here in Canada, but certainly with travel restrictions, and we'll talk about it in a moment, but with travel restrictions, you're not always traveling right away. And so you do want to make sure that when you're traveling to Canada, your medicals are still valid. Now, all of that is the general process for applying for your study permit, right? So the general stream of applying. There is also what's called the student direct stream, okay? The biggest benefit for the student direct stream is faster processing time for study permits, okay? Most applications that are submitted through this student direct stream are processed within 20 calendar days, or at least that's what IRCC says, okay? It is supposed to be at least faster though than the regular stream. So to qualify, you have to be a resident living in one of the 14 listed countries. Those countries do include Pakistan. Okay, so that's why we are covering the student direct stream today as well. So you do have to be actually a resident currently living in one of the 14 countries. Now, with the student direct stream, you have all the regular documents that we've talked about already. Okay, so everything that we've covered so far still does apply, but there are additional document requirements for the student direct stream. So in order to be able to apply through this program and for your application to be considered complete, you have to also provide these additional documents. Now, first, you have to have already paid your full tuition for year one. Okay, so with the regular stream, that's not necessary, but for the student direct stream, you have to provide your proof that your full tuition for year one has already been paid to the school. The second thing is that you also do need a guaranteed investment certificate of $10,000. Okay, so these are provided by specific banks, and there are listed banks that you can go to get a GIC, but that has to already been taken care of. You have to have that ready with you and put into the application. Medicals are required upfront. So where you are residing in a country where you do need to have your medicals as part of your temporary residence application, you can't submit your application and then wait for a request for medicals. For the student direct stream, and this goes to the faster processing times, is that you do have to have your upfront medicals completed and provide proof of those medicals when you submit your study permit application to the student direct stream. Again, police certificates are, if they are required, have to be provided with the initial application. You do have to have your recent transcripts and language tests. Okay, so even though let's look at Pakistan for example, the regular country-specific checklist for Pakistan doesn't necessarily need to have language results. So you don't need an IELTS test, for example, in order to apply through the regular student stream. However, if you're trying to go through the student direct stream, then language test results are mandatory, and you do have to be able to demonstrate that you meet CLB 7 on that language test. Okay, so another big question that we get here is, what about my family? Can my family come with me to Canada? I don't want to leave them behind. I want my spouse and my children to come with me. So when we're talking about family, when we're talking about accompanying family members, we're limited to spouses and to dependent children. Okay, so Immigration Canada has processes in place for family members to accompany, but when we're talking about family members, we're talking specifically about spouses and dependent children. So your spouse can qualify for an open spousal work permit. That means that they can come to Canada, work anywhere in any position. Okay, there's no restrictions on that work permit. And dependent children can also come with you. So they can go to public school up to grade 12 for free. Okay, now when you're applying for your family, for yourself, you want to keep in mind that if your child is under 5, then your initial application will generally be a visitor visa application for them. If they're 5 or over, then you want to be applying for a study permit for them as well. Okay, but either way, both the visitor visa or the study permit will allow dependent children to come to Canada with you and go to public school for free. Okay, and public schools up to grade 12 here. So now that we've covered the application process, we've talked about what needs to go into it, what that document, what the process of applying looks like. Once that application is approved, you need to travel here, right? We need to also look at traveling to Canada once you have your study permit approval letter. Now, this has become a bigger issue, obviously, over the last year and a half, 2 years, because of COVID, right? And so, you know, as much as what we're covering here today is applicable today, when you are looking to travel, you do want to make sure that you double check what the restrictions and what the processes that are in place at that time, because we are changing them all the time. Okay, even over the last few days, as COVID, as situations have evolved, the travel restrictions and the travel requirements are changing as well. Now, generally, okay, to travel to Canada right now as an international student, you have to obviously have your valid study permit or your letter of introduction. So that's the letter that IRCC issues to you after your application has been approved. And you also need to be attending a designated learning institution with a COVID plan that's been approved by the province. And again, IRCC has all the schools listed on their website that have the COVID ready plan that's already been approved. This is a big one. This next point here is a big one. It's more recent. As of January 15th, certain groups of travelers, including international students, will only be able to enter Canada if vaccinated. Okay, so this is a newer change that we've just seen being announced by IRCC. If there's going to be exceptions, if there's anything that they're putting in terms of instructions around it, hasn't been released yet. But the big date that we're waiting for right now is as of January 15th of next year. They are limiting again who can travel and who can fly to Canada. And then lastly, right now, for anyone who is going to be traveling to Canada, so they've already had your application approved and you're planning on traveling shortly, the current travel requirements right now is that you need to have your COVID test completed within 72 hours of your final flight to Canada. Okay, very important that you keep that timeline in mind. It's within 72 hours of your final flight to Canada. So if the ticket that you've booked has multiple stopovers, or even one, right? You want to make sure that the window that you're calculating your window for when you can take that COVID test, the PCR test, within that final flight that you're going to be boarding to Canada. The second thing is that you do need to have a quarantine plan. So regardless of whether you're exempt from quarantine or you're going to be asking for an exemption from quarantine when you arrive in Canada, everyone needs to have a quarantine plan submitted through the ArriveCan app, okay? And that needs to be done within 72 hours of your arrival to Canada, okay? So these are two different 72-hour windows. Important to not confuse them and to keep those timelines in mind. Now, if you are vaccinated with an approved vaccine, you do need to provide proof of that vaccination in the ArriveCan app as well. And that's what will get you your quarantine exemption once you arrive here in Canada. And then lastly, just as of a couple of days ago, IRCC has also announced that there's going to be COVID tests as well when you arrive in Canada. And with those tests, you will need to quarantine until you receive results. Okay. Again, I really do want to emphasize that these travel requirements are always changing. So before you plan your travels, before you, even if you have your tickets booked, make sure you're reviewing what the current travel requirements are before you board or before you go to the airport. Okay, so let's talk about maintaining status. So once you're here in Canada, you've traveled, you've applied, you've traveled, you're here, what do you need to do in order to keep your status? Okay, this is really important because when you arrive in Canada, you'll get your physical study permit. On there, you'll see certain things like, okay, an expiry date For example, location of study, all of those are clear, right? It's written on the study permit. It tells you when your study permit is going to expire. But what it doesn't say is that there are also other conditions of studying here in Canada that are implied. And these are equally, if not more important, okay? So you want to, in order to ensure that you keep your status while you're here, you need to understand what these conditions are, okay? The first is that you have to be enrolled at a designated learning institution, right? So if you remember when we started talking, we said that study permits allow you to come here to Canada to study at a designated learning institution, okay? And so IRCC wants to see that you are continuously enrolled at a school and that you are actively pursuing your studies, okay? So this is another big one, is that while you're here in Canada, you do need to be always making progress towards the completion of your program. This is how actively pursuing studies is defined. And it is a very important concept, okay? So while you're here, you need to, while you're here on that study permit, you do need to always make sure that you're making progress towards finishing your program of study. Now, generally students will be full-time, but part-time studies do still qualify you to meet the definition of actively pursuing studies, okay? So for whatever reason, you can't do a full-time course load, you go on to part-time studies. Yes, that still meets the requirement of actively pursuing studies, but as we'll talk about in a moment, it could still be problematic for your long-term goals in terms of staying here long-term here in Canada. And then the other part is that the study permit automatically becomes invalid 90 days after you stop studying. Okay, and this isn't written on the study permit, but it is important for you to know, is that if you decide to stop studying, so let's say you're doing a 3-year bachelor's program, a year in, you say, you know what, this is not for me. I don't want to study anymore. I'm withdrawing from my program. Well, 90 days after you withdraw, your study permit becomes invalid and you no longer have status while you're here in Canada. Okay, so really important. If you finish your program early, if you decide to withdraw from your program, make sure you keep in mind you only have 90 days of status. After that, regardless of what the expiry date is on your study permit, you no longer have status. Okay, so going back to our example, let's say you applied for your study permit, you're doing a 3-year bachelor's program, your study permit is valid for the 3 years, but after year 1, you say no longer for me, I don't want to do it, you withdraw. It doesn't mean that you have 2 years of status here in Canada. 90 days after you withdraw from your program, regardless of that 3-year study permit, that status will become invalid. Now, the exception to this are scheduled breaks and authorized leaves, and we'll talk about authorized leaves in a moment, but a regularly scheduled break is one that is on the academic calendar for your school and for your program. Okay, so going back to our 3-year bachelor's program, normally the way that they're scheduled is 2 semesters of school and then a summer break. Those summer breaks can be longer than 90 days, but that does not mean that during that summer you lose your status, okay? Because it is a scheduled break, because it's part of the academic calendar for your program, that's okay. What you can't do though, is you can't create your own scheduled break, okay? So if you have, let's say you're doing a 2-year program that doesn't have summer breaks in it, you can't create your own summer break and say that's a scheduled leave, okay? Very quickly, authorized leaves are basically leaves that have been approved by your school, okay? Important though, that they do not exceed 150 days because that's the maximum period that an authorized leave can be, okay? After 150 days, that authorized leave is over. And what I mean by authorized leave being over is that your status no longer will apply on the study permit. Okay, so the maximum period that you can be on an authorized leave on your study permit here in Canada and still hold status is 150 days. If you are still remaining in Canada beyond that, okay, and you're still on an authorized leave from school, you need to either change your status or exit Canada. Okay, and then lastly, you can't work during any periods of leave. And we'll talk about working using that study permit in a moment. When you are on an authorized leave, really important that you ensure that you keep proof of that authorized leave from your school. right? Written proof is going to be key, because when you apply later for your postgrad work permit, or if you have to extend your study permit, all of that will be very important in order to show that you have complied with immigration rules and that you've maintained your status while you're here in Canada. Okay. So, big question that I'm sure all of you have on your mind is, when can I work, right? So I have a study permit. I want to be able to work while I'm here studying and when I'm on that study permit. Well, there's different rules for work on campus and off campus. Okay, so on campus, any full-time student can work without a work permit, so you don't have to apply for a separate work permit for on-campus work where you are a full-time student. Okay, on campus means the facilities within the boundaries of your actual school. If your school has more than one campus, you can work at different locations as long as they're within the same municipality. Okay. You can't work before you start your program. So let's say your program's starting September 6th, for example, you arrive in Canada August 6th. During that month that you're here, that you're waiting for your program to start, you can't start working before then. Okay. Off campus is a little different. So full-time students who have a valid study permit are enrolled at a designated learning institution where your program is at least 6 months in length. You are able to work off campus up to 20 hours a week during the school year and full-time during any regularly scheduled break. Okay, the definition of scheduled break is the same as we talked about before, right? So it's part of the academic calendar for your program for your school. So it's not one that we're creating for ourselves. It's one that's already in the academic calendar. When you're trying to work during a scheduled break, though, you do need to be enrolled full-time in the semester before and after your scheduled break in order to work full-time during that break. The exception to this rule of being a full-time student is in your final semester. Okay, so in your final semester, as long as you have studied full-time throughout your program, and if you only need a part-time course load in order to finish your program of study, then in your final semester, you can still continue to work part-time, so up to 20 hours a week, even though you're also a part-time student. So you're not forced to be a full-time student, okay? Now, once you have received any written confirmation that you have completed your program of study, you must stop working, okay? It's at that point that you're considered not to be a student anymore, and you can no longer work on your study permit. Okay, this is really important. So your study permit, it allows you to work without an actual work permit, but there are very, very strict conditions that are associated with it, right? So we've talked about the maximum hours that you can work. We've talked about when you can work, and really important to keep in mind that as soon as you've received any written confirmation that you've completed your program of study, that you stop working using that study permit. And when I talk about written confirmation, it can be anything that basically indicates to you from the school that you have finished your program of study. It can be your final grades. It can be a letter from the school saying, congratulations, you've now finished. Anything that tells you that you've finished your program of study. And simply, so let's say we're looking at final grades, simply not checking that you have received your final grades is not an excuse for saying that, hey, I haven't finished my program of study. So really important, okay, to keep that in mind. Post-grad work permit. So once you have finished your program, okay, a very important part of an international student's route to later applying for permanent residence is the post-grad work permit. I want to quickly go through the conditions or the eligibility conditions for the postgrad work permit, because you want to keep these in mind when you're also looking at your program that you're selecting to apply to here in Canada and while you're here studying in Canada. So in order to qualify for the postgrad work permit, you do need to have completed a program at an eligible designated learning institution in Canada that's at least 8 months length and that leads to a degree, diploma, or certificate. Now, When you're selecting schools, when you're going onto IRCC's website and you're looking at that DLI list, the Designated Learning Institutions list, online, the final column on the right indicates which schools, even though they're all designated learning institutions, it indicates which DLIs will qualify you for a postgrad work permit and which will not, okay? If you select a school where that last column says, no, not eligible for a postgrad work permit, then regardless of when you finish that program of study, you can't apply for that work permit, okay? And like I said, this is an important step towards applying for your permanent residence later. The second important condition for eligibility is that you have to be a full-time student in every semester of your program, okay? The definition of full-time is dependent on your school and your program, okay? So IRCC does defer to your school for that, but really important that you're a full-time student in every semester of your program, okay? The only exceptions to that are if you're on an authorized leave, your final semester, or if your classes were canceled during COVID, okay? Otherwise, it can mean a refusal of that postgrad work permit, okay? You do have to apply within 180 days. Now, with that in mind, you do want to keep in mind what we talked about in terms of your status becoming invalid after 90 days. So yes, IRCC's website says 180 days, but if you're here in Canada when you're applying for the postgrad work permit, do keep in mind the 90-day timeline as well. A valid study permit is not required at the time of your application, but you do have to have held a valid study permit within 180 days of your submission of the postgrad work permit application. And if you're here in Canada, you do need to have at least temporary status when you're applying for that postgrad work permit. An important question with the postgrad work permit is whether you should apply for it. And the reason is that you can only get a postgrad work permit once in your life, okay? The length of that postgrad work permit will be dependent on the length of your program of study. So if you do a program that's anywhere between 8 months to under 2 years, then the length of your postgrad work permit will be directly associated with the length of the program. So if you do a 1-year program, you get a 1-year postgrad work permit, okay? If your program is 2 years or longer, then you qualify for a 3-year postgrad work permit, which is the maximum length that you can get, okay? Now, you can also combine programs together. So if you do 2 1-year programs, for example, that's 2 years of study here in Canada, you can combine those together to benefit from the maximum duration of that postgrad work permit, which would be the 3 years. If you remember from the previous slide, we said that you have to stop working on your study permit as soon as you have received any confirmation that you have completed your program of study. Well, for students who are here in Canada, you can begin working full-time again as soon as you apply for your postgrad work permit. Okay, so very important. And the last thing about postgrad work permits, online classes, so anything that is considered that's online can be problematic towards the eligibility and towards your qualification for the postgrad work permit. However, with that being said, of course, with COVID, there are a lot of temporary policies that are in place right now. And so anything that's done up till August, if you're outside of Canada, will still count towards applying for your postgrad. Very quickly, next steps. Have a plan and a backup plan as to what you need to do for your immigration goals. So always think about your long term. What's your long term? What's your end goal here? And how do you work towards it, right? And when you're doing that, you do want to make sure it's not just your plan A, but you also have a plan B as well. And then when you have your plan A, when you know what your goals are, you want to make sure that you're taking the right steps so that you can get there in a quickly and in a least problematic method as possible. When you're here in Canada and when you're applying for any type of immigration application, make sure that you stay in status while you're physically here in Canada and don't misrepresent on any of your applications. A huge issue we see, and this is very common, is that you submit your application, someone's directing you to say, you know what, that work experience you have, don't put it on there. It's not applicable to your program of study. So don't mention that you worked for 3 years doing as a mechanic, for example. Well, that's considered a misrepresentation, okay? And misrepresentations can carry with them a 5-year ban entirely from applying again to Canada. And even after those 5 years, it can be incredibly difficult to get any sort of temporary residence application approved, okay? So really important when you're applying, make sure that you're reviewing your application, you're making sure that it's all correct before you submit it. If your application is rejected, do contact a lawyer right away. There's very strict filing deadlines in terms of what the next steps are, what you can do. And so, you do want to have someone who is able to advise you properly and able to guide you in terms of what those deadlines are and what your options are in order to try and fix that. And where you have a refusal, it can be automatic to think, okay, well, I'll just apply again. It doesn't always help to just have multiple refusals, right? If you're applying for the application again, you're submitting the same application, you may just end up with the same refusal, right? So really important, speak with someone, get the proper guidance that you need in order to be able to get that study permit. And with that, Yasser, we can open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you, Zia. Thank you so much for a very wonderful and a detailed session here. Definitely, I have a few questions. So regarding this, there's a question that if someone wants to change his school or study program, how does he change the study permit? How does he get the study permit changed?
Yeah, so when a study permit is issued, generally, the study permit should be just for a designated learning institution. And so what I mean by that is it just says that it has to be a designated learning institution. It's not always specific to the actual school. So it doesn't limit someone from changing schools. So while you're here in Canada, if you decide to change schools, you have to let IRCC know, but you may not necessarily need to apply for a new study permit. And same thing for programs, whether it's within the same school or outside of it to a different school, as long as it's a designated learning institution, it should be fine. You do have to update IRCC. The only complication is where you want to change schools before you actually travel to Canada and get your study permit. In those instances, you may actually need to apply for a whole new study permit with the new acceptance letter before you travel.
Right. Thank you. Zia, there's another question. So you spoke about the DLI program. Oh, sorry, the direct stream program. So, so for that, if there are any Pakistani students living abroad, for instance, living in the Gulf, are they eligible that they come to Pakistan and apply for this direct stream program? Because let's suppose if it's not available there, so can a student who's doing his OA levels or his high school come back to his home country and then apply for this direct stream program?
Yeah, so definitely in order to qualify to apply through the student direct stream, you have to be a resident in that country. So in Pakistan, for example, so if you are currently residing outside, you would need to come back, reside in Pakistan, and then submit your application.
So there is no particular time factor in that? Like he should be residing there for 6 months or so before applying?
No.
Okay. And what if the IRCC rejects the student application while he's applying on this direct stream program? And so is the GIC, which is the 10,000 Canadian dollars, is that refunded? Or in case, I would just add another question to it, that if a student likes to defer his program by a year, in that case, is the amount again refunded, or would that be like blocked with the government there?
So the GIC is through the bank, right? It's not through the government. You're not buying the GIC through the government. You're buying it through specific banks that are authorized to provide these GICs. And so generally the banks do have a process in terms of how you can get that refunded.
Okay. Let me see if there... So there was another question a student is asking that when should he apply for the study permit? For example,
So,
like
yeah,
so for example, like you said, May 15 should be the application deadline and so, right? But what
well,
should be
yeah, May
sorry.
15th was the application deadline this year, right? So in terms of for students who were looking to start in September, IRCC announced in May that, hey, any application that we get before May 15th, we will for sure have a decision by August 6th. But that didn't mean that, so a student could still apply after that. It just meant that, you may not get a decision right before September, for example, right? So it's not so much a hard deadline to say, okay, well, you will be able to start if you don't apply by May 15th, for example. But in terms of the processing times, we just can't guarantee that you'll have a decision in time for the start date.
Right. Right. And so Zia, so you spoke about the work permit opportunities through the studies. What if a student applies for a co-op program? So a co-op program is like in which they cover theoretical. Please let me know if I mean, do correct me if I'm wrong. But what I've heard is that like the co-op program is both theoretical and practical. So the university sends you to industries outside for work experience. Does that also in the long term lead to a work permit, or is that not the route?
Yeah, so programs that have a co-op component to it, when you're applying for your study permit, you would also be applying for a co-op work permit. So it's a specific work permit that you need in order to be able to work off campus in that co-op position specifically. Okay. But that's separate from working off campus using your study permit, for example. Okay. So these are very different concepts. Working on your co-op work permit is specifically only for the work experience that you need in order to finish your program of study, right? And that there's a specific work permit that you apply for, that you receive, that allows you to do that. Working on your study permit is saying it's a route to work without an actual work permit itself. That study permit gives students authorization to work off campus, for example, using their study permit, so without an actual work permit.
Okay, right. And so initially, when you were also talking about the study permit, the visa that you get, so just wanted to clarify again here for myself that initially you get a TRV visa, right? And once you land in Canada, it takes a certain time, around a month or so, and then you get your study permit, like the original study permit stamped.
So the TRV is the one that goes into your passport. It's like a sticker that they put in your passport.
Right.
TRV is like a key. It allows you to board your flight, come to Canada, and enter Canada. Okay. The study permit is your document that gives you status while you're here in Canada.
Right.
When you apply online from outside of Canada for your study permit, study permit, for example, that application is for both your visa and your permit, right? So the first thing you get is your letter saying you need your passport so we can put your visa in there. When you get your passport back, your visa's in there, you will also get a letter of introduction. You take that letter of introduction with you when you travel. When you arrive in Canada at the airport, they will print out your study permit and give that to you on the spot.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Right. Just there's another question. So does it matter if the bank account through which the fee was submitted, it differs from the one from the bank statement that the student needs to provide?
So if they're paying,
sorry, yeah.
So if they're paying their tuition fees from a separate account than what they're using as their proof of funds in their study permit application, that's fine.
Right. So, I believe, yeah. Thank you. So these are all the questions.
Amazing.
And yeah, so I would just like to remind the audience here that this is our website, career.sebstack.com, which is the information portal. We would post the link, the webinar's link here and the slide deck after a few hours after the session. And those who haven't posted their questions, they could even post their questions there, and maybe we could have the answers later. So excellent. Thank you once again, Zia, for your precious time and knowledge that you have given here. And so that's it. Is there any other takeaway that you would also like to give to the audience here or to the students? Anything that you would wrap up with?
I think it's just keep up to date with immigration, right? Immigration is always changing, processes, everything, especially right now with COVID, it's always changing. So just make sure you're up to date with what's happening when you're looking to apply and when you're looking to travel, especially.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.